how would your range change if you're not covering him? That's a totally different scenario. Yeah,
I do agree. That's super interesting. In a normal ICM, if I have 4 BB more than him or opposite, does not really make a difference. So I think the range should be pretty much the same, very polarized, as we pointed out. But in a PKO, if he covers you before big blind, I think it's a big factor because he's going to flat a lot more often, especially if I have a big bounty on my head. He's going to free bet a lot of Broadway hands, a lot of suited connectors. So at this point, playability is a lot more relevant. If I free bet this range against somebody who is going to flat me all the time, well, have fun playing post flop with a king deuce offsuit.
It really depends on what feeling you have on the table. I think a guy who is very great at doing that, and he's showed it several times, is European, where he's basically just trying to get away with as much as possible, basically because people are allowing him it. So if he finds this spot efficient enough to open maybe, let's say, 55%, because these guys from button and cutoff is not defending enough and the big blind is maybe too tight, then adjust to that. So it's basically up to what reach you have on the table and really try to get away with it. But don't go crazy again. But try to build up a adjustment which fit the environments. I see Glenn is having a question of, can you summarize why you put him on it? 28%. What made you give him the 28%?
Okay, so let me try to summarize all the arguments that we have listed so far. We knew the environment is a factor, the stack size is a factor, and overall I think he's chip leader. He can certainly open looser, but given that there are a lot of strong racks behind who are not feared or afraid to play back, he cannot adjust too much. So if a chippy V range here is around 20%, then I think he can certainly increase it, but he should not go out of line. So going from like 22% to somewhere like 28%, for me this is a reasonable adjustment, which I expect him to do. But I do not expect him to go to like 35 or 40 on this lineup of players behind. I think that is one thing I will learn from this session. I think it's really cool if I would show more of really like the work from our members and use that example in showing where it can improve. At what point, buy-in wise, if playing live versus online, do you give the live players the respect for ICM, solvers, and overall knowledge to play differently? I agree that $200 buy-in in local is so different than online. Let's say it's final level starting and there are a few players that have not played before in this tournament. Within a few hands, I can still see, are they very focused? Do they pay attention on like where the short stack's sitting? And if I see those signs, just look at the player beside you. Does he check your stack or the stack of the neighbor of his other side? Then like I'm having the feeling, okay, he's trying to make himself the picture. What's happening here? So he very likely will understand the ICM part. If there is somebody leaning back, just having a drink, relaxing, this guy probably just plays chippy V ranges and doesn't really care too much about ICM. But in general, when you have a bounty final table, there is less ICM involved, stacking off and everything, because there's more money to be won if you get deep, if you get on top. Then you collect more bounties and the first prize gets his own bounty as well. So it's even more top heavy. This is what happens in a normal ICM, that their pushing ranges are 11.5% and 14%. And as you just stated, they need to get tighter when it's bounty. So from 11.5%, the small blind decreases to 8.5%. And the big blind decreases from 14% to 12%, because we can call them looser. One question is, what is you guys' strategy to memorize this kind of results? I think it's not too much about memorizing this specific picture. I think what is important for you is to memorize the factors that lead to that strategy. So you need to remember more playability is required when we get more post flop. You need to remember if there are many stacks that are short who could free bet us, then more blocker heavy range is required and less suited connectors, and therefore also less of the low pairs. I think it's all about understanding and memorizing those logics. Because you said the big stacks, they can just bully you around. They can free bet so loose, but in reality it doesn't work. Because if you really think they're out of line and they're too much bullying you around, then you just go ahead and you forward everything. Like out of this open range, if you know like he's super aggressive, you just forward chip every single pocket pair, you just forward chip every single suited a6. So you don't need to be afraid that they can bully you around too much. I think your result was opening like 12% range, and this would be too tight. So don't be afraid, don't think you get pushed around, you can still open somewhat reasonable.
Yeah, but we also have to keep in mind of like, the amount of full equity we have with the 4-bet is going to change a lot. If we have, let's say we're going to have Bill Lewinsky's bounty compared to the bounty Matthias has in this spot. Obviously we should decrease a lot of our like marginal 4-bets if we had Bill's bounty. Basically because the big stacks can now 3-bet call you wider because there's more bounty to gain.
The next question I read is, I play micro limits and just started thinking in ranges. Maybe it is too much for me. You think it's counterproductive for me to be here, or should hear and try to understand? I think while it's hard for you to follow for sure, like there's a lot of factors, ICM, PKO, ranges, everything together, it's probably very hard, but I don't see any downside. So just give it a shot and maybe see it as something you want to be yourself in like a few months, in a year, in 1.5 years, depending on your personal goals. You need a certain equity. If you have 40% equity against the calling range, you could say, well, you bluffed because you're not ahead if you get called. But that's okay. You don't always need to be ahead if you get called. It's a mix of the fold equity and the equity you have if you get called. So 40 or 45% equity if you get called is a reasonable jam. And this is also what you achieve with a hand like King, Queen suited. You don't have above 50% equity when you get called. But you have good fold equity, you block a lot of the calling range, and if you get called, you still have decent equity. That's what it's about here. So let's start from scratch again. We know our 3-bet call range for value is this one. And instead of adding high cards, I'm just going to add like real bluffs. I'm going to add ace deuce, ace 3, ace 4, ace 5. I'm going to add king deuce, king 3, maybe even queen deuce. When it's an ICM scenario, we want to go really polarized. Why is that? In ICM, when we 3-bet, players are going to flat less. It's not really attractive to flat a 3-bet with 8-6 suited and trying to play post flop. You know, you'll probably lose your stack really often. So there's a lot less post flop in 3-bet bots on an ICM environment. And that also means we don't need the playability of hands like checkmate suited. We don't need the playability of 8-7 suited.